Listen, when you hear a line like, "In 67 minutes NATO collapsed," you should slow down and ask a very boring question. What exactly changed in policy, on paper, with signatures, budgets, and orders? Because nuclear signaling works best when people stop thinking and start feeling. This kind of narration is built to manufacture panic, not to explain mechanism. Here is my claim. NATO not paralyzed, but NATO trapped in a permanent escalation dilemma with Russia. The nuclear shadow is not new. It is baked into European security since 1949 and into Russian military thinking since Soviet time. What changed with Ukraine is that the alliance moved closer to the edge of direct contact, and Russia has every incentive to keep pointing at that edge. That pressure can slow decisions, narrow what gets approved, and push governments towards safe, incremental steps. But it does not mean the alliance died. It means the alliance exposed to its oldest problem: how to support a partner fighting a nuclear power without turning support into direct war. If you want to see this through John Mearsheimer lens, it is incentives and stakes. For Moscow, Ukraine is not just a foreign policy file. It is regime legitimacy, elite survival, military posture on Russia's border, and the story the state tells its own public. For most NATO capitals, Ukraine is important, even morally urgent, but it is not their own territory, not Article 5, not the founding promise that keeps alliance together. That creates asymmetry. When stakes asymmetric, the side with higher stakes can credibly accept higher risk. That is the realist point people dislike, but it is still how states behave. Western leaders are not calculating victory the way internet commenters do. They are managing catastrophic downside. They ask not only can we help, but what is the pathway to escalation, and can we keep control of it when things go wrong at 3 in the morning? So yes, you will hear language shift. Whatever it takes becomes sustainable support. No red lines becomes avoid escalation. This is not necessarily panic, it is risk management under nuclear conditions. And it happens even if you never receive some cinematic secret message through diplomatic channels. Warnings are always communicated, signals are always sent, but the reality is more bureaucratic and more fragmented than the story suggests. Aid is not a single lever pulled by one person. It runs through parliaments, export controls, training pipelines, stockpiles, industrial capacity, and coalition politics. One government pauses, another accelerates. One system delayed, another approved. The overall pattern is not collapse, it is calibration under fear. And you should be suspicious of any script that claims access to secure communications while also speaking in absolutes. In real crisis management, the most common outcome is not dramatic reversal, it is delay, hedging, and internal argument. Ministers call each other, generals present options, lawyers ask what export license allows, budget people ask what can be replaced, and everyone asks one question nobody wants to say on camera. If this spirals, who owns the catastrophe? Nuclear weapons turn ordinary political cowardice into something different. They turn it into a rational preference for ambiguity. Ambiguity lets leaders keep helping without committing to a direct fight. This is where the NATO bluff storyline is also too simple. Western deterrence was never a magic shield. It is a bargain. The United States extends protection, Europeans align strategically, and the assumption is that an attack on one becomes a war with all. But deterrence is not tested by speeches. It is tested by whether an adversary believes you will accept large costs to deny him gains. In Ukraine, the West is denying gains indirectly. In NATO territory, the whole structure built to deny gains directly. Those are two different games, and when commentators mix them, they create exactly the confusion Moscow wants. If public begins to believe we won't fight for anyone, then deterrence weakens. So Russia pushes this narrative, and some Western voices help it spread, sometimes for clicks, sometimes for ideology, sometimes because fear is contagious. Keep your eyes on what states do, not what YouTube scripts declare. NATO continues to train Ukrainians, share intelligence in various forms, expand ammunition production, harden its own eastern flank, and rotate forces. That is not a funeral, it is an alliance adapting to a war it does not want to enter directly. The question is not whether fear exists, of course it exists. The question is whether fear becomes policy or whether policy uses fear as input and still produces action.
Now, what is the real mechanism of nuclear intimidation? It is not nuclear inevitability as mystical force. It is a ladder. A ladder means steps, and every step changes the other side's incentives. When a nuclear power believes it might lose a major war or face regime threatening defeat, it will try to stop escalation early by making the costs vivid and personal. Russia's doctrine has long assumed that a conventional fight with NATO can become nuclear quickly, not because Moscow eager to end the world, but because nuclear signaling is the one domain where Russia can impose caution on a richer, larger coalition. This is why you see constant talk about red lines, consequences, strategic weapons, exercises, deployments, and ambiguous statements. It is designed to make Western leaders argue with themselves before they act. But you must separate three things: facts we know, inference that is likely, and the theatrical layer. Fact: nuclear weapons raise the price of direct confrontation to levels nobody wants to pay. Fact: Western governments therefore structure support to Ukraine to avoid clear NATO-Russia combat. Likely inference: inside ministries, the scariest scenarios dominate the room, so caution becomes default. The theatrical layer is the idea that one message broke the alliance, or that weapon shipments were quietly suspended everywhere all at once. Policy in democracies is rarely that clean. What happens instead is selective restraint. Long-range systems become harder to approve. Certain targets become politically sensitive. Timelines get stretched. Training becomes not ready yet. Reviews become ongoing. It looks like paralysis from outside, but from inside, it is a way to keep support moving while avoiding the step that could trigger Russian escalation. Let me give you one analogy, and then we move on. Imagine a shared apartment building where one neighbor keeps a gas canister in his kitchen and reminds everyone he will light a match if anyone tries to drag him out of hallway. Most neighbors still complain, still call authorities, still help the victim downstairs. But when it comes time to physically grab the problem neighbor, everyone hesitates, not because they like him, but because the building can burn. Nuclear weapons are that gas canister, only global. The side holding it can make others hesitate without being loved, without being trusted, and without being strong, in every other sense. Here is the tough question people dance around. If NATO will not risk nuclear exchange for Ukraine, will it risk it for a Baltic state? The honest answer is that deterrence always lives in psychology, and psychology depends on clarity of interest. NATO exists precisely to make that interest clear on Allied territory. Article 5 is not a promise of automatic apocalypse, it is a promise of collective response, including military force, to restore security. The credibility comes from posture, planning, and presence, not from commentators shouting. This is why you see NATO reinforcing eastern flank, building air and missile defense, prepositioning equipment, and talking about readiness. They are trying to make the Baltic case look nothing like the Ukraine case, because if Moscow believes it can slice off Allied territory under nuclear cover while the alliance debates, then the entire architecture collapses. And this is why I reject the fatalism. Nuclear weapons constrain everyone, yes. They do not automatically hand victory to the side that is loudest about them. They create a contest over thresholds, over credibility, over who can endure pressure, and over who can keep coalitions together. Russia tries to narrow Western options by attaching nuclear consequences to more and more categories of support. The West tries to help Ukraine enough to deny Moscow an easy victory while keeping the war below direct NATO-Russia threshold. This is not pretty, it is not heroic, it is strategic bargaining under the worst possible insurance policy. And notice something else. The loudest claims of NATO panic can themselves become tool of pressure. If voters in Europe start to believe any support risks instant nuclear winter, matter, they push leaders to retreat. So information space becomes part of deterrence. Moscow does not need to convince every minister, it only needs to seed enough doubt to slow the machine. At the same time, Western leaders sometimes exaggerate nuclear risk in private to justify limits they already prefer for political or industrial reasons. So you get a fog of incentives. That is why you should watch material indicators, not rhetoric. What ammunition factories are contracted, what air defenses deployed, what forces rotated, what budgets passed. Fear is real, but fear is not the only variable. Capacity, cohesion, and domestic politics often decide more than any single message. So what does all this mean going forward? First, nuclear signaling will keep returning, like aftershocks, as long as the war continues without decisive breakthrough. Not because Moscow wants nuclear war, but because Moscow wants the West to police itself. The real battlefield is decision-making tempo. If you can slow your opponent, you can outlast him. Second, the corrosion is long-term. Even when aid continues, the constant argument over escalation teaches smaller states a lesson. Guarantees depend on perception of manageable risk. That pushes Europe toward rearmament, toward bigger stocks, toward more air defense, and toward a more serious conversation about its own deterrent, including French and British nuclear forces. It also pushes Washington to choose where it will spend political oxygen, because it cannot run unlimited risk ladders in Europe and Asia at the same time. This is where people invoke China and Taiwan, and they are not completely wrong. Beijing studies how coalitions react under nuclear shadow and how democracies argue with themselves. But the lesson is not nukes make you unstoppable. The lesson is that nukes buy you space to take risk, and they buy you room to test opponents. That space is valuable, but it is not infinite. If you overplay it, you trigger counter buildup. If you underplay it, you lose deterrent effect. So a nuclear power still has to manage credibility. And credibility is not only about threats, it is about capability and willingness to absorb costs. My judgment is this: the West should stop talking in absolutes and start building a posture that makes the choices less terrible. That means hardening NATO territory so Moscow never sees a cheap opening. It means supporting Ukraine with systems that raise Russian costs steadily while keeping channels for crisis communication open. It means expanding industrial base so support is not a political drama every month. And it means being honest with publics. There is no risk-free option. If you do nothing, you invite more coercion. If you do everything instantly, you may trigger escalation. Strategy is choosing which risks you accept and which risks you refuse. So watch one indicator, and it tells you whether this is panic or policy. Watch whether NATO shifts from episodic aid to standing war economy-style production and forward defense posture. If you see long-term contracts, larger ammunition output, more air and missile defense in the east, and more joint planning, then the alliance is not broken, it is adapting. If you see budget freezes, readiness cuts, and diplomatic scrambling without military follow-through, then yes, deterrence erodes. The next moves will not be decided by one dramatic 67 minutes. They will be decided by years of decisions made in conference rooms, factory floors, and parliaments. And that is exactly why the propaganda tries to compress it into a single shocking moment.